And of course, the fundamental problem here, which isn't necessarily a problem if BRICS is going to go on for decades, but is certainly a problem for the first decade of BRICS, is that nothing has really gone as well as folks would have hoped.
To understand geopolitics, you must have the freedom to be honest. The More Freedom Foundation podcast. Hello, Rob. How are you this week?
Rory, I'll be honest, I'm hopping mad, but hopefully I can rail it in enough to do a decent job today. I've got to say, there's nothing that makes me more angry than Verizon customer service. It's an indicator of how badly services have been decaying in the United States. I'd say call it late Reaganism, but the way that a technical system that is actually fairly simple and has been established for decades at this point and takes a lot of money from me, the way that they can screw up the most basic of opportunities to take more money from me blows my mind.
Oh my goodness.
All right.
Does this involve going to a G7 country?
It does, in fact. I am heading to Italy for a week or so, and I'm feeling very lucky about that. But less lucky about not being able to use my cell phone when I am in Italy.
Well, since you're so annoyed, would you like an alternative to the G7?
You know what? I think that's an amazing segue there. That is an amazing segue there, Rory. And brings us to the topic that we are talking today, which is BRICS. The famous...
Which originally was BRIC.
Indeed.
Which is also funny.
Indeed. Initially cooked up by Jim O'Neill, a British Goldman Sachs analyst. In 2001, it has, through a extraordinary process of transmogrification, became an actual international institution. And today I'd like to talk about what's interesting about this organization. And I also want to talk about why BRICS makes me sad. And I think we'll do that in a couple parts. I think that I've been castigated on the Discord, I think rightly and at some points excessively, for coming across as being super anti-BRICS. I am not super anti-BRICS. In fact, I think it would be a good thing if there were alternatives to the G7, if there were alternatives to U.S. power structures. I just don't fully believe that BRICS is anywhere near actually being such a thing. And I think that, in part, the fact that we're in 2023 and BRICS, cooked up by a Goldman Sachs analyst, is somehow the best chance for challenging U.S. world empire, does strike me as a little pitiful. But that doesn't come from a place of hating BRICS or thinking non-aligned movements or different diplomatic initiatives are a bad thing. It comes from a space of being frankly disappointed that BRICS is all we have on offer at this point.
Was BRICS originally like an investment portfolio that they offered? Like, oh, you can invest in these, emerging countries that are doing well?
I would not be surprised at all. I don't know the details of what Jim O'Neill was offering in his investor letter. It may have been more of a broad-based thing.
It's pretty much just these countries are doing well, so, do you want to invest in them?
I am sure that you can buy ETFs, exchange-traded funds, composed out of anything, a certain industrial sector, and I'm sure there's some BRICS ETFs out there. I don't know if Jim O'Neill or Goldman Sachs specifically was hawking those, but it was just kind of an interesting concept, an interesting thing to put out in the world, and I think...
And a catchy enough name.
It was certainly well regarded within investment circles. I remember reading about BRIC countries in the 2000s in The Economist and other business press. When that changed, as with a lot of other things, was in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, which was quite accurately perceived as U.S. generated and an indication that the U.S.-European sort of duopoly of financial power, geopolitical power, was something that should be challenged. I'd say a much more interesting grouping, an article by Jim O'Neill that I read this morning pointed towards it, is the G20, which is sort of a combination of the G7 and the BRICS countries, more or less. And that grouping in the aftermath of 2008 played a huge part in getting us out of 2008, helping us to get clear of the financial crisis. BRICS has always been a more amorphous thing. Essentially, in 2009, the Brazilian and the Russian foreign ministries, two foreign ministries that are famous for innovation, shall we say, that may challenge the United States and NATO more generally, decided that it would be a good thing to actually meet as BRICS countries. So it took almost a full decade, but in 2010, the first BRIC meeting took place, and I think at that point, South Africa was invited to join. So the initial 5 countries were
2011. I think South Africa joins.
Perhaps that it was 2010, 2011, something like that.
There.
So BRIC became BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China became Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now, I did take Scott's criticism on the Discord to heart, and even more so, famous arch-imperialist Noah Smith put out an article recently saying BRICS is fake. And I am far from ever wanting to agree with that guy on foreign policy. So I do think it's important to point out at the beginning that this is an interesting organization. It is an interesting idea. And there are aspects of it that you can't really do anything other than celebrate from the context of like the late 20th century. Like the big meeting that was supposedly the big meeting that was, frankly, I think, to many people or to many elevated expectations of BRICS, that was a disappointment. I guess it was at the end of August, I believe. There was a big BRICS meeting in South Africa. It was sort of doomed from the start. South Africa sort of kind of convinced Putin not to come because they thought they might have to arrest him for war crimes.
Don't you hate when you have to arrest someone for war crimes?
I vaguely recall that like Xi Jinping was maybe ill and didn't give speeches he was expected to. There was this big press conference that was supposed to reveal the currency plans and the institutional plans, and they just kind of canceled it. All of that aside, the fact that in South Africa, in Pretoria, I believe, just the iconic, from my youth, the iconic capital of white supremacy, that a meeting like this is happening, I think is extraordinary. I think that it's, considering we're going to get to this, and considering what BRICS is today, I think there's a lot of scope for mockery. There's a lot of scope for disappointment. There's a lot of scope for sadness. I think the title of this episode is going to be BRICS Makes Me Sad. But if you zoom out a little bit further, the idea of this coalition of largely non-European countries getting together and having a meaningful summit of some degree of independence from the U.S. and Europe in South Africa, with African-led South Africa as a lead participant and host, is, from the perspective of a middle-aged man, amazing. It is a huge step forward. It is a sign that the world is getting better, is getting over the era of unquestioned Euro-American hegemony, and that's good. And I think that is something that should be celebrated. So BRICS is not a bad idea. The problem right now is what BRICS has not done in its decade of getting together, and just the incredibly problematic nature of the 5 countries in BRICS to start with, and then, of course, the 6 new countries that it has added at this meeting. It's just, it's actually, I would argue, gotten significantly worse with those new additions. But before we get to that, can you think of some nice things to say about BRICS, Rui, before we get into our whining about it?
Well, I do like the fact it is very global. It does seem to symbolize countries from most of the continents that usually, were lower down the pecking order. It has raised their profiles. And obviously the fact that China and India aren't the best of friends, and it is a place where they're going to be constantly meeting and trying to negotiate with each other, can only be seen as positive.
Exactly, and that's something I wanted to pull on, specifically the Noah Smith article. Was like, BRICS is stupid because China and India can never be friends. And I think that's really, really exaggerated. I think that the United States, Washington, D.C. specifically, looks at that border between China and India and is like, look at these crazy, like, rugby, Mad Max death battles that they have in the mountains. They hate each other. They'll never get along. And I think that really understates the size and extent of both China and India.
But I think it is incredible that it is sort of demilitarized. They're not allowed to carry guns or anything. So when brawls carry out, there was sticks, which I think is a lot more humane than, if they went, things could quickly escalate if artillery and the likes get involved.
Exactly. I think it's honestly one of the most civilized things going on in the world right now, frankly, that absurd border. So for those who aren't familiar, China and India do not agree on their border, but they have I'm not sure if it's codified in any particular treaty or armistice or something.
Had nothing to do with Brits leaving and not really filling out the paperwork properly. That's never caused any issue ever.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't catch the sarcasm. It has a lot to do with that.
It's also just so incredibly remote. It's the highest mountain range on Earth. Like, there's very few people up there, and it's easy to see why there wasn't really much of a fuss 100 years ago.
So it's never been fully. I don't know if it's fully codified or what have you. But what happens on this border is that they have brawls. The Chinese and Indian troops have brawls with bats and spikes, and sometimes dozens of people. Sometimes dozens of people get killed. It's apparently quite brutal. But it's also one of the most, if you consider like the context of Russia and the United States, who have weapons that can literally murder the planet and can't get themselves to sign treaties on it anymore. The adults in the room, China and India, have decided, like, we have this dispute. We're not going to settle it. So we're going to do this very, weird looking. It's I guess it's somewhat foreign to our Western eyes or whatever. Come to this weird arrangement where we just don't give in and we just sort of agree to disagree and occasionally be violent about it. But it strikes me as incredibly intelligent, incredibly civilized.
There aren't any civilians killed as far as I'm aware. It's not like, artillery's hit a school or anything. It's the soldiers are agreed to this and they get involved.
Yeah, well, I think it speaks to me like with a tolerance for ambiguity in international relations. It's actually very similar to the agreement that China had really up until the Trump and Biden administrations with the United States over Taiwan. The problem, of course, is that China made this deal with a bunch of pale-faced savages in the United States who aren't intelligent enough to understand ambiguity and not the need for diplomacy and not creating black and white horror shows. And unfortunately, the pale-faced savages in Washington, D.C. are likely to push it into World War III. But it is fascinating, and I think that the Indians and the Chinese are quite capable of, as more civilized countries, frankly, are quite capable of maintaining this ambiguity over the border while also cooperating with each other. I think that in Washington, D.C., I think we are investing way too much in this idea that, China and India are natural enemies. Like, China and India have a lot of borderlands between them filled with religious minorities that both of the large countries are getting significantly less tolerant of. This is very obvious, very clear, very apparent with Xinjiang and the way that China treats the Muslims of Xinjiang and the way that Modi's BJP party treats the Muslims of India. But honestly, like the Tibetan Buddhists, the BJP, the Hindu nationalists there just aren't as many Buddhists in India, I don't believe, as there are Muslims. I could be entirely wrong about that, or at least they don't have the political valence that the Muslims do connected to Pakistan. But Tibetan Buddhists and as India gets more Hindu nationalists, they're not going to be super psyched about their Buddhist minorities either.
Is that why you're surprised to see more Muslim countries being added to the BRICS?
I don't know that I'm surprised by the additions to the BRICS. I think that the Muslim countries that have been added to the BRICS are just fundamentally. I mean, there's a little bit more to Iran, but Saudi Arabia and the UAE are just gangster states.
But could this help Muslims in the likes of India and China at all?
No, I will go. I'll say quite straightforwardly, no. It is. I think Saudi Arabia and the UAE are certainly the UAE has gone further, but both Saudi Arabia and the UAE have like distanced themselves from the old time Muslim solidarity cause of Palestine, and they've never really cared about what's happening to Muslims in Xinjiang. I think I thought there was something about. I think Modi was even invited to the Organization of the Islamic Conference, which is sort of another multi. And I might have gotten that acronym wrong, but it's another international organization. And Modi, who has famously started his political career being in charge during, how connected he was to it, but during a pogrom of Muslims in Gujarat. Yeah, so the idea that Saudi Arabia or the UAE give an eighth of a shit about what Modi is doing to Muslims or what China is doing to Muslims is unfortunately, I don't think it borne out. I don't think that's the case. But this China-India, that point you were making is that this just sort of assumption that China and India are natural enemies and are just going to go to bat for us. They're going to be our Soviet Union. To play the role that the Soviet Union played during World War II. I think that's maybe. It's true. They are two massively powerful countries next to each other. And over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, half century, it's entirely possible or even likely that such a dynamic of tension would build up between them if the United States was smart about it. Unfortunately, I think the United States is vastly more likely to sort of, start World War III over Taiwan in the next 5, 10 years and then be like, India, come on board. And they're going to be like, no. And just as we were, India's our new ally or what have you. This is something that the second Bush, the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations have all been working for 10, 15 years now. Completely understandably, India's like, yeah, I'm going to keep buying oil from Russia. Thank you very much. So I think that small disappointment that we've had over Ukraine could be amplified over Taiwan. So the idea that BRICS is farcical, that it's stupid, ridiculous, fake, that is incorrect. That goes too far. And I think especially any organization with China and India at its core is a real deal, is something that is...
But I think there will be obvious tension in the future because it's likely that China is close to its maximum capacity wealth-wise, while India has a lot of growth. I think if you just look at trains, for instance, it seems to be the trains got everyone in Australia assuming China's going to be the next big thing. But, they've high-speed trains all over the country, while Indians' trains, there's more people on the roof than there are people getting trains in Ireland. But what they're doing is then they're going to start the developing now. So we're going to see a huge amount of development in India. It's got a huge amount of growth, a huge amount of potential. And it is, currently on, better. It's much friendlier with the rest of the world. Considering isn't it Google is run by an Indian? Quite a lot of, big Western companies are headed by Indians.
Indian Americans.
Oh, yes. Some are still just flat out Indian. So they have a much better understanding and are more welcomed in the world. So we are going to see this flip between, when China and India are eye to eye in the future. So possibly Brits could help with that, but it's BRICS.
BRICS. I mean, it's reductive, but I do tend to look at everything from European models. And, I think a question is, Will China and India be the heart of BRICS the way that Germany and France are the heart of the European Union? Do they have to fight two horrible world wars first, or don't they? That's an open question. But I think you're right on talking about it does look like India is a growing power, whereas China might be a stagnating power. It is important, however, to realize that China has grown so much more than India, and it's entirely possible. It would be great for the world if India experienced a decade or two like China just experienced, or let China experience in the 90s and the aughts. But I don't think it's anything to rely on, unfortunately. But also, the fact that China is not, despite the Peter Zeihan's and whatnot, China is going through a period of stagnation and crisis. But the idea that it's about to just blow up or disappear, or that's simply not there. Like, China is here.
The common one I see a lot is what happened to Japan. It just kind of stagnates, and then everyone's not scared of it anymore.
I think that's a real possibility, but it's not going anywhere, and so we're going to have this second.
If judging by human history, there's always generally some sort of China knocking about.
Indeed. So BRICS is going to have the second biggest economy in the world, and the most hopeful, or at least the big economy that we have the most hope about, BRICS. So BRICS is not nothing. BRICS is not something without tremendous potential, tremendous interest for the world. I think we've cleared our throats enough, and now we can start talking about how BRICS as it exists now is
a bit iffy.
A bit iffy. That is a great word. BRICS is a bit iffy, and frankly, BRICS makes me a little sad. Gosh, where to even start? I think the first thing to start with is that BRICS really hasn't done much. I think it came about, and this is something else that is of value. The talking about BRICS, the flurry of excitement about BRICS, is a result of U.S. world empire failure. At periods when U.S. world empire F's up dramatically, that's when people start talking about BRICS. So BRICS first jumped from a Goldman Sachs research paper into a real meeting between people in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. BRICS is important now because a lot of the world, the global south more generally, feels really abused by the fact that the United States and Russia and the Europeans decided to have a major war in their breadbasket in Ukraine and Russia. And as I don't think I've made much of a secret about, I tend to blame, because the United States is infinitely more powerful than Russia is, I tend to blame the United States a little bit more, never getting away from the evil of what Putin has done in actually choosing to invade. And I think that outside of Europe, outside of the United States, a lot more of the world sees that, like, wait a second, like, these are people who are like leading Africa, Latin America. They're like, when I went to school in the Soviet Union, he was part of the Soviet Union, and now they're being armed with F-16s to fight Russia. I'm confused here. And I think there's a lot of that can look a lot less straightforward than it looks to us in the U.S. and Europe and our obsessions with the evils of Vladimir Putin. So, despite the fact that we may not portray it that way, the war in Ukraine that has jeopardized fuel and food and fertilizer prices for the entire world is another era of 2008 level failure by the West. And that's why the BRICS is something that we're talking about a ton right now. The sad fact is, and I think is what's very likely to occur unless the United States screws up, goes to war with Iran or something, which is always entirely possible. I think that BRICS is having a moment in the sun, the way that it did back in 2009, 2010, and is very likely to be moribund for another decade or so. Unless the United States screws something else up dramatically, which is always a possibility.
The other thing that the sort of people that love the BRICS are big contrarians, I find. It tends to be the America's dead, Europe's gone, the EU's going to break up, and the BRICS is going to start a new currency, and everyone's going to love it, and the dollar's in the bin.
Yeah, that is definitely the approach. And that is, and you know what? Like, there have been periods when I think it's really easy to fall into those kinds of visions of what's going to happen if this is your first time around. But this is my depending on how you measure it. This is my third or fourth time around of like paying rigorous attention to a worldwide crisis. From the war on terror to the financial crisis to the COVID crisis to Ukraine. And there's always these people come out of the woodwork to say, this is it. This is the end of American hegemony. And they're almost always wrong. One day, Rory, they'll be right.
But it sells papers and gets clicks.
It does. So the main thing that has actually been delivered by BRICS, I think this came around in 2014, was the New Development Bank. And the idea of the New Development Bank is that it's going to be, to some degree, a replacement or a supplement to the things that the IMF does, essentially bailing out. Actually, no, I think there was another mechanism that was supposed to be more IMF-like. Perhaps the New Development Bank was more to replace the World Bank and what it does. Funding development, and BRICS was supposed to also provide sort of economic backup so that people didn't have to go for the IMF and their U.S.-focused priorities or what have you. And the consensus is that the New Development Bank exists. That's a thing. That's hard to do. But the consensus is that it really hasn't done much. I got at least 3 sources on that. That sort of the New Development Bank is
it seems to just do some development in member states, but it's nothing, crazy.
I mean, that's a start, but I think even those numbers are low. So there is a development bank; it does exist, but it just hasn't. It has not met its promise. And of course, the fundamental problem here, which isn't necessarily a problem if BRICS is going to go on for decades, but is certainly a problem for the first decade of BRICS, is that nothing has really gone as well as folks would have hoped. It's interesting. I read an article by Jim O'Neill of the BRICS fame, who...
It's all his fault.
It is. Well, yeah, I mean, he's dining out on that today. I mean, what
Don't
an
show how
extraordinary...
powerful one person can be.
Yeah. But he didn't even ever really have to do much. He literally, I don't know, had a few drinks.
Kind of reminds me of Moore's Law, the thing in processors doubling every 2 years, is it?
Oh, Murphy's Law. No, not Murphy's Law.
Yeah,
Moore's Law.
Moore's Law, he worked in IBM and he just noticed, this pattern, and he's like, this might continue for the next couple of years, and now people think it's like the Bible, and if processors don't do it, then civilization's doomed. It was more just like, these countries are doing well for the past couple of years, and now it's an international organization.
Yeah, I mean, Jim O'Neill, I don't know what his career was outside of BRICS, but he got knighted. I don't know if it was because of BRICS, but it certainly was part of it. He's Sir Jim O'Neill, I guess. And I think he really, had a few drinks. It was like, that'd be funny. I'll put that in an investment letter. And, a decade later, there's an organization. But I think he pointed out that he was impressed with the development of the BRIC countries as of 2010. He can't say that in 2023. China has, of course, become the behemoth that it is, but China is now stagnating. India, we've all got really high expectations, but we've had really high expectations of India since at least the 90s and their neoliberal turn. And it does seem like Modi, after some, frankly, early disappointing years, does seem to be putting up some good numbers on GDP growth, but it's still nowhere near what people were hoping. And both Brazil and Russia have just been a real extraordinary disappointment over the past decade.
What's holding these countries together? Because the big criticism is there's not really a lot in common with these countries. You have some that are very passionate about democracy. So I think in Brazil, isn't it, you have to vote? India is very big in democracy. China is no democracy at all. And I don't really know what's happening in Russia these days. It's quite, vague.
I think that what holds them together, all these countries together, is resentment of the United States.
I heard Lula basically saying, I don't want this to be in loggerheads with America. I don't want this to be a counterweight to the G7. I just want this to sort of help the sort of poor nations, the global South, have somewhere to meet. He's really downplaying it.
Well, it depends on the day. And that's what's so interesting about the countries that they've let in most recently. You've got You've got one.
If we thought India and China had a few beefs, there's a couple of beefs being let in here.
Indeed. I guess maybe we should just get into it. So Brazil, Russia, and South Africa, the country that made it BRICS instead of just BRIC, have had a horrible decade. And that's because China's growth miracle has been stagnating since 2015, 2016 or so. And commodities super cycle or what have you. I don't know exactly. I'm not using that terminology appropriately, but the super cycle crashed quite some time ago. And everyone had expectations that Russia's invasion of Ukraine would make commodities incredibly valuable again. And it just hasn't. So that's sort of the problem with Brazil, Russia, and South Africa. And if there were already conflicts and problems economically and politically unstable places in BRICS, the murderer's row that has been added, should we do drum roll? You're getting good with the music cues. I think there'll be something here. We have Argentina.
If you're starting a new bank, they're the one country you want, aren't they?
Yeah, obviously. The ideal person to owe you, a country to owe you money is Argentina, for sure. They are legendary for serial defaults. One of the only countries, apparently they have a unique moniker, which is formerly developed country. The only country on the planet.
Weren't they like the fourth wealthiest country in the world at a point? So they're used as an analogy to show that countries can go backwards, things can go terribly wrong.
And I think that can be overstated. I have family that live in Argentina. We have friends on the patrons only Discord that live in Argentina and love it. My understanding is that the quality of life is still quite high. But yeah, it's nobody's idea of a serious geopolitical player or a serious financial contributor to any kind of multilateral financial institution. It is, however, Argentina does appear to have Argentina has a real democracy and functioning institutions, which makes it different from every other country on this list.
Wow. So Argentina is at the top of the class, in your opinion?
Yes. So Brazil, South Africa, and India can welcome the lone fellow democracy to what is now a authoritarian collection. Ethiopia, the guy's been spending the past 3 years. I think he did win an election that may or may not have been free and fair, but he has spent the past 3 years going after his country's ethnic groups in succession. So
would he be as democratic as Russia? Would you go with that?
The problem comparing Russia and Ethiopia is that Russia has a lot of ethnic issues that have been more or less settled, whereas those issues are very open in Ethiopia, have been opening actually as the country spent 20 years getting richer, and that actually sort of gave folks more money to be more interested in their ethnic rights and self-determination. So I think that Ethiopia is just such a different stage of development. So it's hard to make that comparison. More democratic, it's had, I think, 3 rulers this century. That's more than Russia can say. So Ethiopia is probably more democratic than Russia. Okay, so that's Argentina. Egypt, which is probably, there are a lot of prognostications, a lot of predictions of doom around countries, and I don't believe many of them. I do get very close to believing them when it comes to Egypt. Egypt is a country with serious challenges.
And it doesn't have any beefs with anyone else in the BRICS.
Indeed. No problems there. It's true. Egypt is surrounded by a number of countries that it is, despite having no fiscal stability or political stability in its own country, that it is also deeply involved in all of its neighbors, in weird political ways, in opposition sometimes with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, sometimes in partnership with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It's just
Egypt and Ethiopia aren't getting on over river rights?
Yes, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is, I made a somewhat mocking video about it a number of years back. It was it's another concept, much like BRICS, that people love to talk about. Essentially the greatest infrastructure project in Ethiopia's history. Actually, I think the Aswan Dam was the greatest infrastructure project, or one of them, in Egypt's history. And Abiy Ahmed and actually his predecessors set up this dam as well. It is, of course, damming the Nile. So if they choose to fill that dam over 16 years, it shouldn't really be a problem for Egypt. If they choose to fill it in 2 years, Egypt dries up and blows away. And Egypt has been really angry about that dam for quite some time.
But it just gives them huge power over Egypt, essentially.
It does. And it's funny because I hadn't even thought of that. So of the 6 countries that are admitted to BRICS, 2 of them, 2 separate pairs of them have long-standing grievances that war has been threatened over. So yeah, but Egypt is just an incredible basket case, an incredibly unhappy country with a dictator that came to power in a day, slaughtering as many people as Assad did to justify that massive multilateral 10-year effort to overthrow him. It is an incredibly populous, incredibly interesting place with extraordinary history, extraordinary people that has been run like a madhouse ever since 2013. And the idea that it's any kind of addition or ornament to a group is frankly ludicrous. Next up, Ethiopia. The place to start would be this is actually almost uniquely a country with a positive economic story of the 6. So Argentina is the only democracy. Ethiopia is the only one with a positive economic story of any sort to be told. Ethiopia has been an incredible standout. In the 80s, when I was growing up, I first heard of Ethiopia as the home of starvation. It is now on its way to becoming a middle-income country. That maybe overstates it a little bit, but it is
definitely for the region. It makes it a standout, considering what we have: Sudan, which is in civil war, and Somalia, which is hard to even call a country at times.
Indeed. So it is far outdistant its regional peers on the continent more generally. Has put up multiple years of 10% economic development. It's a very interesting place. Unfortunately, as was the case in Europe, this advent of wealth has led to hypernationalism. And it has led to hypernationalism not on the broader Ethiopian front, though the current leader, Abiy Ahmed, is trying to build something like that, but in terms of the many diverse ethnicities of Ethiopia. The Oromo, the Amhara, the Tigrayans are probably the 3 most powerful of those. Start from November 2020 until 2022-ish. We had a savage civil war between the Tigrayans, who had run the country, and Abiy Ahmed, who invaded Tigray. Multiple allegations of atrocities on both fronts. It's entirely possible that hundreds of thousands of people died, and we'll just never know. That conflict seems to have ended, and now Abiy Ahmed is turning on the Amhara militias. I was corrected. He's not turning on the Amhara as a whole, but he is turning on the Amhara militias who helped him crush Tigray. It's entirely possible that 20 years from now, Abiy Ahmed will be remembered as the father of his country, as someone who did this Machiavellian stuff that finally allowed Ethiopia to truly consolidate and become a middle or even high-income country. It's also entirely possible that his project will end in chaotic horror and a refugee crisis that truly swamps the European Union. That is 100 million people, 110 million people in Ethiopia, 110 million people in Egypt. It is worth mentioning that among these, Egypt and Ethiopia are the big ones. Any organization that countries over 100 million people join is, has some serious weight
sizable. There. And that's one of the, this was before these other countries were added, that compared to the G7, the BRICS represents 41% of the world's population, while the G7 only represents 10%. So with these other countries being added on, it's going to obviously get closer to 50.
Yeah, I think that is worth pointing out. So yeah, these are big, serious countries, but they are all big, serious countries with huge frickin' problems. Huge frickin'
And not
problems.
a lot of money, most of them.
Yes, and not a lot of money, most of them. Okay, so that's Ethiopia. Iran is certainly been cozying up.
It has no problems with anyone.
It's true. Everybody loves Iran. Super straightforward, easy place to deal with. Got a lot of oil. Let's just move on. Iran obviously has incredible tensions with Israel, with the United States. I certainly blame Israel and the United States more for those problems than I do Iran, but regardless, they exist, and this is not going to help. Honestly, this dooms any idea of a BRICS currency, of a broader financial competitor to the dollar. It just doesn't.
Because just to give context, with the likes of sanctions and how they're affecting the new development bank, ever since the war in Ukraine, all projects in Russia have been stopped because they're scared of association and then getting sanctioned from the other big organizations. So if Russia's getting sanctioned and they're not helping there, something similar will probably happen with Iran.
Yeah, that is amazing that the actual BRICS bank, the new development bank, has cut off Russia. It's fascinating. And I think again, like I just don't want to be like these smug European American guys being like, like there will come a time when there is a real alternative to the U.S. financial system. U.S. crimes and U.S. arrogance has guaranteed that, but this is not that time. And the addition of Iran in this context is a guarantee that these BRICS ideas around a rival currency, a serious attack on financial hegemony, just aren't going to fly. It's just not going to happen. Because Iran is massively, massively sanctioned, not just by the United States, but also Europe. There was a period of time when Europe was pushing back against Trump's busting out of the JCPOA, but after Israel stepped up its assassination of Iranian civilians in Iran, Iran busted out of the JCPOA as well, and Europe has also brought sanctions back.
But then also a lot of other countries then also scared of being sanctioned by America also avoid Iran.
Yes, exactly, and that's the problem here, is that if you're gonna put together a rival currency bloc, a rival anything to the United States, you can't involve countries that most countries are afraid to deal with, and that's what Iran is. As unfair as that may be, and then of course,
Iran's good friend.
But Iran's good friends, my two favorite countries, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. It's just. And this is actually, I think I've talked about Saudi Arabia at great length. These are absolute monarchies. It is I think, a great tragedy and historical anachronism that absolute monarchy still exists, but it exists there. They are petrostates. UAE has probably put the things in place necessary to survive new lower oil price eras. Saudi Arabia has not. But the most important thing here is that these are not countries that are going to be aligned against the United States in their existence. We love talking about it. We love the degree to which Saudi Arabia and the UAE are internal U.S. political actors at this point. The fact that they have chosen a political party, the Republicans over the Democrats, is they're just another. These countries are fundamentally just another U.S. lobby. You've got the tobacco lobby, you've got the Israel lobby, you've got the really powerful lobby, the American Association of Retired People, and then you've got the crappy little Gulf state lobby. Like these are not even U.S. They are U.S. dependencies fundamentally. And this idea that like adding them to the organization certainly adds wealth, world GDP percentage. It looks prestigious, but it is the fundamental beclownification of the current iteration of BRICS, is adding Saudi Arabia and the UAE to an organization and imagining that there's any kind of anti-U.S. empire. thing. Frankly, it's the full incorporation of BRICS into U.S. world empire, adding these countries. If Saudi Arabia, as I believe it will, by 2030 becomes Arabia, and the Sauds, go to their ends on the French Riviera and the suburbs of Washington, D.C.
Well, it's going to fall hard, Saudi Arabia. Like we've talked about, China will probably just stagnate. Like it's going to be chaos.
It's gonna. It depends. Well, frankly, Rory, it depends on how much we choose to make it chaos. If we sign some kind of deal with the royal family, the true betrayal of the tradition of every founding father. Even founding fathers who owned slaves would be able to look down at us from a high moral height if we signed a security agreement with disgusting absolute medieval monarchies. They'd be able to do that. But
did you hear about their tourist plans?
They've
seen what the United Arab Emirates are doing, and they're trying to recreate that. Their plan is to have 100 million tourists a year. Do you know how many tourists America gets a year?
I don't know, 10 million, something like that?
It gets 80 million. So they're trying to sort of outcompete what America gets. And this is somehow going to magically get ready and work, which I find quite hard to believe.
as do I. Well, it's all nonsense and fairy tales. I've had friends who've auditioned or have tried to get jobs. I have acquaintances. It's the amount of money that they're spending is amazing. And in return, they're just paying people millions of dollars to lie to them, billions of dollars to lie to them. It is quite farcical. But just the topic of Saudi Arabia's dissolution, if the United States truly decides to wipe its ass with a Declaration of Independence and truly defecate on the legacy of every founding father and create a security agreement with a medieval monarch, then we could totally keep MBS or one of his successors going in Riyadh for a decade and a half of true abysmal horror that would absolutely reignite international jihadist terrorism thing that would, if we're that stupid. Yeah, but honestly, if the United States just goes...
And also if oil is less desirable in 20 years, which is very possible, why would you bother with Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I think it's very possible. So hopefully we can do the right thing. That's a good video. I should make that. But
is it possible that these, countries that aren't the best of friends, shall we say, in this organization can have positive outcomes?
I think that, we talked about how India and China are very capable of working well together. And I do think that Egypt and Ethiopia and Iran and Saudi Arabia, we've seen recently, can sort of rise above their clashes. But I do think it's harder for these smaller, they're not small countries, Egypt and Ethiopia, but smaller countries with more existential issues between them than China and India do. Some remote Himalayan border where they've sort of already agreed to disagree is a different, a different set of circumstances.
A giant dam drying up.
Yes. I think it's an interesting question. The interesting thing about UAE and Saudi Arabia that I think unfortunately is true with the rest of... Actually, Egypt should also be in that column. Egypt is very much a client of the United States, not to the extent that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are, but, we give them a couple of $1 billion a year, tremendous military cooperation. Yeah. So I think this wasn't said by me. This was Panjak Mishra, writing in Bloomberg, basically pointed out, and I'm paraphrasing here, that, the main goal of BRICS succession for almost all of these six new countries is just as a bargaining chip in getting more out of the United States, which is profoundly depressing. And so this is supposed to be the alternative. This is supposed to be
I don't need America. We can do our own thing.
And it's 100%, certainly for Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt, to an extent with Ethiopia, even with Iran, definitely with Argentina. It's just a bargaining chip. It's just a way to rebel in a little way and try to get more out of daddy. That's a really, really minimizing and diminutive way to put it. But unfortunately, that's what. And these six new additions are distinct from that. Like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, maybe less so today for a lot of those countries, still very much so for India and China, are countries of real roaring independence and strength and non-aligned power. These 6 countries that have been added are not that at all. It's a beclowning of the potential of BRICS. And it's sad for me because, like, I believe that a real alternative to U.S. world empire power, like, I don't want like a real military alternative. Thankfully, nothing like that is in prospect, but a real institutional weight that would occasionally check the United States in its abuses of sanctions and its abuses of financial power would honestly make the United States smarter, much smarter, would make the United States more moral, would force the United States to be better in the way that it treats countries. And frankly, I think in the long run, it would make us stronger. So it's not some kind of like, I hate America, blah, blah, blah thing. Like
America would have to be a bit fitter, a bit leaner.
Exactly. The United States is, I mean, this is a fundamental ideological precept of a lot of folks in Washington, D.C. who just believe that the United States is a better country when it's competing with another country. So I think that I want there to be like a real BRICS. And it's just, I can already hear Malta screaming on the Discord server. But I really think we had that. We had a real alternative to the United States in, like, on every dimension in the European Union at the beginning of this century. And I think through a lot of U.S. actions, through a lot of European failures, the EU challenge to the United States has evaporated, especially after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and the Europe is now more dependent on the United States than it's been at any point since the 1950s.
Speaking of energies, reminded me that one of the criticisms is a lot of these are energy producing countries. So it seems, as you say, it's hard to see why they've been in, apart from they're able to get raw materials, particularly gas and oil.
I do want to just finish my thought. Like, to go from 20 years ago where we have the EU, like we're gonna have a world of negotiation, and to have the EU being essentially completely knocked off of that position, and then we're all supposed to get excited by this collection of autocrats and U.S. dependencies getting together in a little club. It's frankly quite depressing.
They're going to make their own currency, Rob. You'd better be worried.
Yeah, we should. We should close talking about the BRICS currency. That is something I'm in whole agreement with the merciless mockerts. Like,
but what is the idea that this would just be a theoretical like currency that's only used for this new development bank, or are they legitimately saying Brazil, China, South Africa, Russia, India are going to change their currency to this one BRIC currency?
Nobody.
It's just vague.
No, well,
it's just dollar bad.
Yeah. So on the Bitcoin fueled internet, crypto circles, everyone's like, yeah, it's gonna be a new dollar or what have you. What you've actually seen are some countries saying, maybe we should trade in our own currencies a little bit more, and then often backing off because it's too difficult. I think that especially in the direct aftermath, and the very scary direct aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the very scary spike in oil prices, some ostensibly serious people, supposedly serious people, started talking about resource-based currencies, and this is new, and Bretton Woods 3, and and it was always nonsense. And a lot of the serious people who are talking about that have backed off pretty quickly. If you're talking about a BRICS currency that is going to replace the dollar, look at the euro, which was an infinitely more serious effort by a bunch of countries that had.
But it also made a lot more sense since most of these countries border each other. Like, if Brazil adopt this, I guess they can trade to Argentina now, but South Africa, who are they trading with?
No, I think there's a lot of scope. I couldn't dream of trying to explain to you what special drawing rights at the IMF are now, but there are absolutely serious, far short of a euro or dollar style adoption of currency, absolutely, if these countries seriously sat down together and decided to put together some kind of alternative financial architecture, they could do something very interesting. The thing is, none of them are interested in doing that because they all remain way too reliant on dollar hegemony and dollar transactions.
But do you think they even like each other that much? I was listening to an Indian economist, and he was basically saying we just sort of, turn up and give lip service. We don't really care that much about the BRICS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's just we look at the euro, which has successfully become a reserve currency, is still, but compared to what the promise was and the expectation was at the turn of the century, it has not done what had been hoped. It has not replaced the dollar, and it is just infinitely more serious. And the reason that the euro has stumbled to a degree is because of, highlighted in a series of crises, the Europe itself, despite agreeing on many political things, agreeing on many cultural things, agreeing to have a European central bank, which nobody has even dreamed of suggesting with BRICS, still was not unified enough in its economic, Germany's too invested in doing its own thing. France is still too invested in doing its own thing. The UK, when it was doing a completely different thing, it just wasn't there yet. And the fact that the euro, with all of the things they have in common, failed to actually make something real, or make something that could really compete with the U.S. dollar, leads me to believe that
I wouldn't say it's a complete failure, but it's definitely not reached its full potential, and I think there's a lot less emphasis. It used to be like, if you're in the EU, you have to take the euro, when a lot of countries like the likes of Denmark are kind of like, yeah, you'll probably be able to keep your currency as long as you want. We're not really, there isn't the same, will to force it on others.
Well, I think for at least a decade or two, the euro is going to have the 2009, 2012, 2013 crises hanging over it. And then eventually, actually the euro is much further along than BRICS is, but BRICS, the potential is still there. The potential is still immense. The euro is infinitely more serious than the idea of a BRICS currency, and you're just not going to see it. And not never. A lot of things can change. Things have changed a lot in the 2 decades I've paid attention, and things can change a lot more over decades. But it's on the decade scale. It's not. Everybody was super excited about this South Africa conference. They were going to announce incredible things, the BRICS currency, and nothing. Now everyone has switched to, well, there's a conference in Russia next year, and that's going to just change everything. And I'd be surprised, frankly.
Are there any large corporations or organizations you are hopeful for?
I could be hopeful for BRICS, but it's pretty long term.
Yeah. So do you think these new countries are going to be a drag on it, or... Because, it felt almost like these, original BRICS have been together so long, they understand each other, they've got the run of each other, and now you've just thrown all these other countries. It feels a bit like, well, you're just the newcomers, I don't really have to listen to you, or, it's muddied the waters, and it's also then, diluted their power.
Honestly, I expect BRICS to keep meeting and keep promising things, and slowly peter out until the United States screws up the next big thing, and then we'll hear a lot about the BRICS again.
Is the G20 the one we should really be looking at, since it does seem to be a meeting of the two?
Well, I don't think, my understanding is that the G20, after being so useful in the aftermath of 2008, is now kind of moribund. I don't know if they still have meetings, but I think it looked from 2008 to 2010 that this was going to be a new powerful force in world government. And
because it does seem to just sort of be like, the G7 plus the BRICS. It's a wee bit more of even distribution of world population and wealth.
Yeah, I think Indonesia, and isn't Turkey a member? I think the G20 is potentially a much more promising and serious instrument of world government than the G7 or BRICS are. But my understanding is that currently it's not a big thing.
Not doing too much.
But hey, so I hear the Discord server. I shouldn't mock BRICS as much as I do. It is something that has long-term potential.
You're not angry. You're just disappointed.
I'm just incredibly disappointed, Ray. BRICS, it makes me kind of sad.
Well, on that note, we'll catch you next time. All the best. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.